Hello again. So last month's timeline was definitely a lot of fun. Had a lot of fun playing around with the whole loose storyline during May. So I thought we would take a look at another timeline this month. So June, obviously the traditional month of weddings and whatnot. So I figured let's start with a wedding timeline and then just work our way through. So the first film I wanted to take a look at is the 2005 film The Wedding Party. This is actually a German film. This was distributed through TLA's Danger After Dark label. It's definitely a very interesting story. It's kind of hard to just put a straight label on it. It's not necessarily a horror film, although the cover of the film does give that impression that it's very gory, which it really isn't. The film itself was actually marketed as having been a comedy, which it also really isn't. There are some humorous moments, but it's not a comedy. It's not, a black comedy or, a horror comedy, anything like that at all. I'd say if you have to slap a label on it, at the very least it'd probably be closer to maybe an action film or just maybe a very tense drama. So it's kind of hard to just put a straight label on this one. But nonetheless, if you go into it knowing that it's not a horror film, it's not a comedy film, you're more likely to enjoy it rather than going by the misconceptions that's displayed by the film box or just going by the actual comedy label on the box. So the film does begin with Mark and Sophie's wedding. They're making their way to the wedding reception, and along the way the father decides to just stop by and hunt some pheasants. This is the first indication of just how crazy and eccentric the father really is, just stopping on your son's wedding day to kill some birds when you're heading on the way to a reception. You've got a cooked meal waiting for you and you're going to kill a bird. That is extremely logical, but it's a foreign film, so I really don't know if it's just more of, say, a character thing or what. So they do kill their birds. They make their way over to the restaurant. At this point in time, the father, Herman Walser, makes his way into the kitchen and he meets Franz Berger, who happens to be the owner of the inn where they are going to be dining. And he makes an offer to buy the property once again. Obviously, Berger says he's not interested, shows Mr. Walser out of the kitchen. They sit down to have the meal. And the first course, or the appetizer, the shrimp cocktail, doesn't taste quite right. So Walser, just being, I guess, the big bully that he is, storms out, just basically has everyone leave right in the middle of the meal or before the meal has actually officially started, and he refuses to pay the bill. During the argument, some wine had been spilled onto the bride's dress, so the mother-in-law and the bride are actually in the restroom trying to clean the dress during this argument. Obviously, everyone leaves, and they are left behind. So Berger obviously realizes he has some leverage. He locks the women into the bathroom, and he also locks the front gates. That way, Walser cannot return. So that's sort of where our first bit of conflict does begin. Obviously, the film is just nothing but one long conflict, which gradually just becomes more chaotic throughout, and you wonder to yourself, how far is this going to escalate? Is this ever really going to end? Or, how far are these people really willing to take it? So that's definitely part of the interest in staying with the film and just continuing to watch to see what will happen. Eventually, they do hole up in a vacation home from, some Americans that just obviously travel. They hole up in the home, they stay there for a bit, and they basically just stay there until evening when they make a second attempt to rescue the women. Obviously, before leaving the property, or actually later on they do return to the property, there is an incident where they throw a grenade onto the premises, just sort of assuming it was something that was defused and finding out that it is still live. So there is a vehicle that just literally blows up on the property. So there are obviously some guests that are staying in the hotel. The story really doesn't focus on them too much. They're just sort of more of the subplot, or just sort of trying to keep the interest going. So it's definitely very interesting if you think about it from their point of view. Obviously, there are people that are staying at the hotel also. They were having lunch at the same time that this whole conflict occurred. And suddenly there's an explosion on the property. So definitely pretty crazy. And that's all within, of course, the first 30 minutes of the film. That evening, they do return. Berger's dog, Riesling, does happen upon them, attacks one of the men, and the dog is shot, which brings us to our next bit of escalation right there in our ascent into madness on this wedding day. There was also a party from Berger's side, had been also injured during the fight. He basically is brought in by one of the employees, brought into a room rather, and we have just a bit of threatening going on as well. He has his hands tied behind him, and we have this whole odd spiel about how do you think you would do in prison, what do you think happens to men in prison, and the man goes on to compliment his victim's mouth and then asks him to close his eyes and open his mouth. So it's definitely a very tense moment. You're probably thinking to yourself, I really don't need to see this, but it's actually pretty funny as the fact that he's being threatened. Obviously we hear the zipper, and the next scene we basically cut to a sausage being shoved into his mouth. So this was obviously just sort of a cruel joke. This is definitely one of the lighter moments in the film. There really aren't too many. Maybe another one of the odd moments in the film would be the grandfather just sort of complimenting his grandson on his wife's cleavage, which really isn't necessary, but once again, I guess it's one of the quirky moments in the film. In the ending sequence, Walser basically just mows down the front gate with his vehicle. By this point in time, everyone's just very exhausted. This has all happened within the course of one day, and he basically comes onto the premises. The women are obviously released. Everyone's had enough of this nonsense, but it definitely does make you think, aside from someone's stubbornness, and the real reason all of this occurred is because Walser wanted to purchase Berger's property. That's what the real conflict was. It had nothing to do with the meal itself. So we definitely do have a lot of pride and stubbornness going on in both men's parts, but it definitely does lead you to wonder if the newlyweds stayed together after all of this. It's, definitely a test of character, but you often think to yourself, well, a wedding day should be, a memorable day in most people's lives, but I definitely don't think it'll be remembered for the right reason. So this was definitely the wedding from hell. Either way, if you're willing to take a look at the film, it's actually pretty good. It has a few slow moments, not too bad. They don't drag on for too long. The movie keeps a pretty decent pace. Obviously, it's not really a straight-out horror film, so there really isn't too much gore, aside from just maybe a few people just being shot during the whole siege scenes. But other than that, pretty good film. I would definitely take a look at that, and I will talk to you later.